Wax on, wax off. Don't forget to breathe. Very important.
Relax. It's time to expand your horizons. My name is Jake, and this is the Photoshop and Illustrator Unleashed podcast. If you're just starting out in this world of motion design, then you might be curious how people in the real world are actually using Adobe software. Well, for today's podcast, I got to talk to the amazingly talented Sarah Beth Morgan, who works with Photoshop and Illustrator on a daily basis. She works as an illustrator and art director at Oddfellows, which is an amazing studio you should definitely go check out. And her husband, Tyler Morgan, is an animator who also works at Oddfellows. So we get into some really interesting discussion on how that dynamic works, professionally working with your significant other, not only in their day jobs, but also on personal projects at home. And I could brag on her all day just talking about her amazing work because I'm such a big fan. But instead, you can listen to her tell her own story. So sit back, and I hope you enjoy this podcast. Well, thank you so much, Sarah Beth, for sitting down and talking with us, taking time out of your busy schedule.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
We're really excited to get to talk to you and kind of pick your brain about your illustration style and how you got to where you are now. So why don't we just start with some background on where you're from and what you do for a living?
Yeah, for sure. So I grew up in Saudi Arabia, actually, and I've lived a multitude of places since then. I mean, obviously, there's a reason I was in Saudi. My dad works for the oil company there, and so I moved there when I was 6, and then I spent my childhood there. And from there, I went to boarding school in Ohio and college in Georgia at SCAD. Okay. And then I was in LA for 2.5 years before moving to where I am now, Portland. And I get to illustrate for a living. I'm an associate art director at Oddfellows in Portland. And yeah, it's really exciting. I get to do what I love every day.
That's amazing. And Oddfellows is one of the probably most popular places to be working right now. I think that some of the best work in the industry is coming out of that studio. If the students listening, if you're not familiar with Oddfellows, we'll put a link to them in the show notes so you can go check it out. But why don't you just tell me a little bit about what it's like working there and how you even landed that gig?
Yeah. Thank you, by the way. We're really excited to hear that. But it's kind of, I don't know, it feels like kind of just dumb luck how I ended up here. When my husband, Tyler, and I were living in Los Angeles, we just weren't really happy living in the city there. I don't know. We both had cool jobs, and we were learning a lot there, but we just weren't into Los Angeles as a city. So we were looking into other cities like Portland. We had looked at Seattle in the past, and we wanted to stay on the West Coast and but probably somewhere with more nature.
Sure.
We had been talking to Oddfellows a little bit. I don't really even clearly remember how it happened, but we were talking to Chris, the creative director, over email, and kind of decided to make the move up to Portland before actually getting jobs, which was jumping the gun. But we were we just want to get out of LA. So but we basically just dumb luck. We decided to move up, and they're okay, you're hired. So awesome. Tyler and I both actually work at Oddfellows together.
That's awesome. I'm definitely going to want to dig into that a little bit and kind of see what that dynamic is like working with your husband. But yeah, I can relate to that whole LA life thing. I lived there for almost 7 years with my wife, and kind of got to the same conclusion of ready to be away from that city. I really enjoyed it while we were there, but I feel like that's kind of the story with a lot of people is eventually, especially if you're from someplace else. I grew up in Michigan, so I was ready for 4 seasons again, so we moved to Denver, and we've been loving it here. Yeah,
Los Angeles, it's so good for pushing your career forward. If I didn't move there right out of school, I would have probably not been where I am now, I guess. But yeah, I couldn't stand it. I was only there for 2.5 years. It just wasn't really conducive to my health, I guess.
Yeah. Yep. I can totally relate. So you mentioned that you're an illustrator at Oddfellows, but do you also animate?
I studied motion graphics, and I prepared to be an animator out of school, but I pretty much just design and illustrate now. Granted, having the knowledge that I learned from school, After Effects knowledge and some Photoshop animation knowledge like really helps me with my design and illustration skills at work. But I don't actually use After Effects often at work.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm pretty much just use Photoshop and Illustrator. So, yeah.
Sure. Cool. So was that kind of just a natural thing that came about? You just realized that you liked illustration more, and that's something you wanted to pursue, or what got you to that point since you were studying motion graphics?
Yeah, so when I was in school, for some reason I was under this impression that when you go into the motion graphics industry, you have to be a designer animator. Like, I mean, a lot of people are, but for some reason I didn't realize when you got to like a studio, a lot of times there was, just a design team and an animation team. And when I was in school, I thought I had to do all of it because we kind of did on our own projects.
Right.
And so when I got hired at Gentleman Scholar, where I worked in LA, I got hired and like didn't understand that they hired me mainly as a designer because I think that's what they like saw potential in me with. And so when I got there, I was like, oh, I got to do everything. And they kind of I mean, I told them I was comfortable with both, but I think they like could tell and had some kind of intuition about like what I was better at and what I liked more. So they kind of geared me towards the design side rather than the animation side. And I definitely felt more comfortable there. So I think having that little external push from my bosses at GS really helped me push myself in the design and illustration side rather than pursuing animation.
Yeah, that makes sense. I'm just, I guess, a little curious. Are you like happy that that's the direction that you went in?
Yeah, I'm super happy. Like I think I was frustrated when I first started in the industry because I'm like such a perfectionist and I want to do everything myself. But after being on animation projects for so long, I'm so grateful that like I have a specific role because I got to really hone in on my design style and learning Photoshop rather than trying to like stretch my skills across multiple programs. So I think at first I was like, oh man, I don't get to animate my own illustrations, but now I'm like, oh, there's so many people who can animate it way better than I could ever animate it. So I'd rather have them make my illustrations move than me.
Sure. Yeah. That's a really great perspective on it because a lot of people, especially freelancers who are working for themselves, don't get a chance to see that kind of a collaboration and being able to focus all of your efforts on being a better illustrator obviously shows through your work and allowing other animators who are solely focusing on that aspect of the creative process, kind of handing the reins over to them. It just produces something that's so beautiful. And like I said, your work shows just what focusing on being an illustrator can do.
Yeah, no, I'm like super happy that this is the direction I went because, yeah, animators are just like wizards, like
Right.
I have the freedom in my illustration to do whatever I want rather than being constrained by my own animation skills. Like I think when I was in school, I couldn't really make anything that cool because I was like, oh, how am I going to animate this? Like I can't design that. So now that I know that people are capable of kind of just doing anything with my illustrations, there's more freedom in it, I think.
Yeah, that's awesome. And again, I think that's kind of vice versa, where as an animator or motion designer, sometimes all we can see in our heads is how something should move, and we can't think of the design part or how it should look as far as the illustration goes. So, yeah, it's a really cool dynamic.
Yeah.
So you mentioned you used Photoshop and a little bit of Illustrator. When did you start using those? Did you have any kind of experience prior to college?
Yeah, a little bit. So I prior to college, I was in a lot of art classes and stuff, but I started with Paint Shop Pro 8.
Yes.
When I was in the middle. Really? No way.
Yeah. I don't know if 8 was the version, but Paint Shop Pro was the first graphics program I used.
I looked it up yesterday because I was curious and it was like 2004 or something, like when Paint Shop Pro 8 was around. So I was like, oh.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was like when I was in middle school actually. And when I was living in Saudi, I was like pretty bored. There's not really much to do there. It was like really hot outside, and there's no malls or movie theaters, so I kind of had to get creative with the kinds of stuff I do, and that kind of led to PaintShop Pro 8 and Photoshop and making music videos with my friends and all that. So I wouldn't say I was like doing it for like professional aspirations, but I was like,
Sure.
but I got to play with it a lot when I was a kid, so that was helpful, I think, in pushing me now.
I love that you said PaintShop Pro, because I was kind of in the same boat where I was in middle school and just I had the opportunity to be on a computer and mess around with the software and just play with it. Basically, it was a toy to me. So yeah, even though we weren't, necessarily developing our creative abilities at that point, it was still, I think, a really good thing to be able to get access to something like that at such a young age.
Yeah, it was totally like the foundation. And I think it was like the only one I could find for free or like hack.
Right.
That's why I started in PaintShop Pro versus Photoshop.
Yeah. What about sketching on paper? Do you ever do anything by hand, or is it pretty much all digital?
I wish I sketched on paper more. It's mainly digital now. I really wish I did more drawing and creating in my free time, but mostly for work, since I'm usually on, fast turnaround projects or trying to like share files with my coworkers, I tend to start just in Photoshop or just like writing things out rather than sketching first, because I think it's just the fast turnaround. For some reason, I'm just like, okay, once I start on my Cintiq, I'm like ready to go, So
that actually, real quick, brings up a point. The Cintiq, if you don't know what that is a graphics tablet where you can draw directly on the screen, almost like paper. It's pretty much the closest thing you can get to sketching on paper while you're actually using your computer. So how do you actually, because I don't have a Cintiq, do you feel that way about your Cintiq, that it's pretty similar to being able to just sketch something out really quickly and freely?
Definitely, yeah. I have a 22-inch Cintiq at work and at home. I just bought one. I got really spoiled because they provided them to us in college at SCAD.
Oh, yeah.
And so that's kind of how I learned to illustrate professionally. So I'm just like, I think I wouldn't be able to do what I do without my Cintiq. That's just me personally. Like, I know there are lots of talented illustrators and designers out there who just use like an Intuos tablet, but I definitely cannot use an Intuos tablet.
Yeah, and the Intuos does not have the screen. It's just a flat, like a giant trackpad, basically, that you're drawing on. And from experience, like I've used a Cintiq. My wife has an iPad Pro, so I've used AstroPad to control my computer, and I also have an Intuos Pro. And it's a night and day difference. I totally agree with you that it just is a completely different beast of not looking at your hand while you're sketching versus looking at the screen and seeing what you're drawing.
Yeah, I think there's something, I just have no hand-eye coordination, like, at all.
Yeah.
Like, for some reason, I have hand-foot coordination. I'm, like, really good at, like, DDR and stuff, but I just can't do
nice.
hand-eye coordination, like, any kind of sport or anything, so the not being able to like see where my hand is drawing is like just a disconnect for me. But I definitely would recommend trying out Cintiqs to anyone who's curious. It's not cheap, which is unfortunate, but if you can like try it on anyone else's Cintiq or try an iPad Pro, I'm sure that's similar. I think those are super helpful.
Yeah, I agree. I've gone through all different kinds. Like I used the Cintiq, I used the Surface Pro 2 and 3, and I just agree that you should try it. Absolutely, the iPad Pro is a great device because you can use it for more than just the graphics tablet, obviously, but it also is very similar feel to the Cintiq. But if you're serious about illustration and you just want to dive in, you pretty much, like, Cintiq is top of the line. So, great advice. Definitely try and test one out if you can. So I'm curious, what does your illustration process kind of look like with your Cintiq in Photoshop then? Because I'm looking at some of your art on your website right now, and some of it is really, really clean geometric stuff, and I would imagine that you'd want to do something like that. Like I'm looking at a bee on top of like a honeycomb right now. And like that kind of thing, I would immediately think I'd want to do that in Illustrator with a bunch of vector shapes and then add texture later. Is that how you're working, or what's your process for that kind of thing?
You'd think I would use Illustrator for that, but no. I think I'm pretty much committing design sacrilege by using Photoshop for that. I think I just got so used to Photoshop that I started using shape layer tools in Photoshop instead of using the much more intuitive Beziers of Illustrator. I think for some reason, like the workflow of Photoshop just is so much more organic to me. I really like being able to texture my work. As you can see, like if you're looking at that bee illustration, there's a lot of texturing and lighting and blurs and yeah, I don't really know if there's anything super hand-drawn in there, but it's so much easier for me to have the shapes directly in there and to be able to like mess with them rather than Illustrator. I mean, I actually use Illustrator for like quite a bit of work at Oddfellows, just because like if we do a lot of Google work, it has to be very clean.
Right.
But for my own personal stuff, when I'm like texturing, it just makes more sense to use Photoshop. So my workflow is usually like I'll like sketch something out on my Cintiq, and then I mean pretty much the whole time I'm using my Cintiq, and I'll sketch a few things out, maybe a couple options of layouts, and then I'll start cleaning up the shapes. Like a lot of times I'll just draw them by hand because I don't know, like something about Bezier, like vector shapes sometimes don't feel as, I don't know, like friendly to me.
Sure, yeah.
So I, sometimes I'll even like make something with vector shapes and then I'll like trace it with my hand because I'm like, trying to get a more organic look.
Right.
Yeah, and then usually then after I have all those like shapes and colors laid out, I'll go in and like texture things. But there's no like distinct way I do it. It's usually pretty kind of like whatever I'm feeling that day. I'm like, oh, should I texture it first or color it? Or Yeah,
I can totally understand the whole wanting to just get going in one piece of software, because at least at the time of this recording, there is not a really good workflow of getting your stuff from Illustrator to Photoshop, at least not in a way that just makes jumping from one piece of software to the next really quick. There have been developments from going from Illustrator to After Effects and back from After Effects to Illustrator that have been really good lately, but as it stands right now, it's just not a very easy process. And students are about to be jumping into Photoshop very soon, and they're going to see those vector tools that you talked about, and you kind of mentioned that they're not quite as intuitive as Illustrator. They're about to find out just how different the two different programs can handle the same type of thing. So but that being said, like I can understand just wanting to make it right in Photoshop and get onto your sketching, into your textures and things like that, because Photoshop is really the program you're going to be wanting to do your textures in anyway, especially when you're doing it by hand.
For sure. I mean, there's tons. I mean, I've worked with a lot of other illustrators on projects, and there's so many people who, especially if you're doing a project that looks more vectory, a lot of people will illustrate in Illustrator first, and then they'll like separate all their layers out in Illustrator, and then they'll like drag each layer into Photoshop, which seems like kind of a hassle in my opinion, but they'll drag those layers into Photoshop and then like texture them after everything's already laid out. Which probably is like better if you want to be able to scale your work, because my problem with Photoshop is like it's raster based. So if I like make something and I'm like super happy with it, and then like a year later I decide I want to make prints out of it with a high resolution, I'm like, oh well, I made this like tiny for my Instagram, and it doesn't. It doesn't scale like Illustrator would. So.
Right.
Yeah.
and that's a specific topic that our students are going to learn about very soon, because we've spent all our time so far in Illustrator where resolution really isn't an issue. You scale up anything you want scale it down, scale it back up again, it won't matter. But it's a different world in Photoshop, working in a world of pixels instead of vectors.
Yes.
Cool. So I'm curious. You must be used to collaborating with other people working at Oddfellows. We already touched on that a little bit. But what does that kind of look like on a day-to-day process, like on any given project? Where are you in the production process of a given piece, and how are you interacting with the other parts of the team?
Yeah, totally. It's been an awesome experience at Oddfellows. We're actually a really tiny internal team. There's 9 of us total. And it's been really fun getting tight-knit with everyone and figuring out our workflow together. I've learned a lot from my coworkers, but it's also so great collaborating with artists across the globe. Like, we work, like almost every project we're on, we work with remote freelancers. So I've gotten to learn a lot from those designers and illustrators as well. But as far as the workflow, where my role is, I've recently been like art directing more projects. So I'm usually on it from the beginning to the end, which is really cool to be able to see a project unfold. Like in our industry, a lot of times if you're a designer, you pretty much just stay on from the beginning until like the middle of the project, and then it gets handed off to an animator, and then you're just like on another project while they're animating it. So it's been really cool to see the whole process through. So I'm pretty much there from like maybe even the script writing phase. Like Oddfellows works really often direct to client instead of through an agency. So a lot of times we'll be on from the very beginning of the project. Like they'll just have like an idea and they're like, help us make it into a script. So we'll, I mean, internally our like art direction and creative directors might help come up with the script, but then, or we can hire like a writer. And then from there, we're like thinking about the narrative and the concept and the story behind everything. So storyboarding, and I'm usually like on that phase. And lately, since our team is so small, if there's like a new project that's in, it's like usually just me storyboarding on the project I'm on. And then like coming back to our creative director and like bouncing ideas off him. And then from there, like obviously we have to, speak with the client the whole way. About what they like, and there's lots of rounds, but from there we go into the design process. And from that point, like this project I was just on recently, it was a really fast turnaround project. So we hired designers, all remote designers. So it was like me, I felt like I was kind of a little bit like just sitting alone in a room, but then I was like chatting with, we had Emmanuelle Walker on it. She's in the UK, I think. And so there was like one night I briefed her at like 11 p.m. because of the time difference. And then, like I worked on some frames and she worked on some frames, and then like we had a couple other people come on. And yeah, from the design phase there, like that project was super quick. So we had like the design in like 4 days. But lots of client feedback, and me going in maybe sometimes to other people's files and like tweaking them. And then from there, like once we got approval on that, just diving right into animation. And I kind of like from there left the project off. Like Tyler, my husband, was leading animation on it as well. So I kind of passed the files off to him, but kind of gave him like a clear picture of like what we were thinking of everything. And since they're all great animators at Oddfellows, and we had a couple remote freelancers, they kind of worked their magic, and it turned out great. But yeah, on the animation phase, I'm not as involved, but I still stick around to like, double check everything, make sure everything's staying true to the design, language, and just making sure we're hitting all the client notes.
Okay, cool. Yeah. So first of all, you and your husband sound like the Oddfellows power couple. That sounds awesome. But you mentioned that for that whole process, that was kind of the art director role. How is that different from just being an illustrator, like maybe one of the freelancers that you hired?
Yeah, for sure. Well, that was actually like my role for the most part these past like 4 years. So pretty much like for like especially if I was the freelancer in the UK, like I would just get like direction from the art director and then work on like said frames. Usually like
Right.
just a designer, illustrator, not someone who's helping concept as much on the project, will already have like direction on the content they're supposed to produce, like what the story is, and like okay, here's the specific frame, and here's like the style we're thinking, and yeah, like here's our color palette. So usually you're kind of given all the tools, and then you dive right in and make it your own. And then that's usually passed off to the art director, and they give you feedback, and you tweak it based off that. A lot of times also, like when I was in LA, this happened a lot. We don't do it much at Oddfellows, but there are lots of like pitches. So those are when the client comes to a couple studios and they're like, hey, like we want to work with you, but we want to see what you're thinking for our project before we hire you. So when I was at Gentleman Scholar, we'd do a lot of pitches where it'd be like 2 or 3 days where they'd be like, okay, here's the concept. Just make something that looks really cool that we can show the client. And then if they like it, we can make it. So
Sure.
that was always kind of fun because it was just like you got to kind of make what you wanted. I mean, not always. There's usually like some direction, but it was more open and it was like a one-off frame.
Right. Cool. So it sounds like as the art director, you're having a lot more of a creative role or hand in the whole process, and you're dealing with the client more and then managing people. Whereas as a designer who's brought on as a freelancer, they're pretty much answering to you, and they have a specific responsibility to you and not necessarily directly to the client.
Yeah. Usually, the illustrators or designers, I don't know how it is at every company, but at least at Oddfellows, it's like,
Sure.
I don't know. I think sometimes being on client calls is like overwhelming. It's like,
Oh yeah.
they also give you a lot of feedback, and then it's like the art director, creative director's role to like, interpret the feedback and make it not as scary. So
yeah, because the client doesn't always know exactly how to communicate what they're thinking, right?
for sure, yeah. And a lot of times there's a lot of voices on the client end, so it's like, all right,
Yeah.
like let's make it like let's decide what's doable, and then we'll give that feedback to someone who's designing.
Sure.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about your husband, Tyler, because I can vouch for him. He is an amazing animator. You're not just biased. But you guys both got in at Oddfellows. So you said that this is only a team of 9. I didn't realize Oddfellows was that small. So you must have a decent amount of direct contact working with your husband there. So what is that like?
It's great, honestly. I mean, he sits right behind me, so I don't have to stare at his face, but I know he's there.
Yep.
And yeah, it's great. I mean, like, it's when we're working on projects, like passion projects together at home, like, it's totally different because there's no structure, but at work, it's just, I don't know, it feels pretty easy because we both have our, set roles, and there's structure and hierarchy in the company, so we're usually working on like different ends of a project for the most part. I mean, lately since I'm art directing more, we're on more projects together, but for the most part, it's like, okay, he's the animation expert, I'm the design person. I mean, obviously, like we can have opinions on either side, but
right.
For the most part, like those are our roles, so it's very clear like where each other stands, so it ends up being like super organic and easy to work together at Oddfellows. And on top of that, we get to like experience the same things every day, so there's not like that disconnect when we come home. Like when I was in Los Angeles, I worked a little bit far from home, and then so there's like a commute, and then like my days were longer there, so a lot of times it just felt like we never saw each other. So
yeah.
I much prefer working together than not working together. And I think like working together at Oddfellows has brought us closer and has also taught us how to work together.
That's so awesome. And I'm just, every part of this conversation, I'm so amazed about how similar our careers kind of are. Even though I'm not working at a studio, but my wife and I both work from home and work for ourselves, and we work together. Like we both teach online, and She majored in graphic design. I minored in graphic design. My major was called digital media, and that's what she minored in. So, anytime that I need a graphic made, she's always helping me. And she's also very much into hand lettering, and I cannot sketch by hand for the life of me. So, we have the same kind of dynamic where we can hand the strong suit that we're good at, to the other person. And so when she needs animation, I'll do that. And when I need design, she'll do that. The only time it gets complicated is when we we have different opinions. But so you already kind of touched on this, but working on passion projects, like you said, at home for personal work, do you ever run into issues like that where you are kind of butting heads, where you have strong different opinions on how something should move or how something should look?
Yeah, I think definitely. When we worked on a short film together, Cocoon, that we released like last year, and that was actually like our first project together in the motion industry, and it was like a big project. It was a big undertaking. So that was especially hard. I think more than anything, it's like me being bossy, and then me also, like, I just always want to get things done, and he's like much more patient and wants to take things slow. So I think on passion projects, when there's like no distinct schedule, it can definitely get harder, and we can butt heads. But overall, I mean, that project I'm referencing was like our first project together. So that's probably like a bad example of us working together. But we recently worked on like just a short for Animography's Award a Week together. And that was like a totally different experience. I think it was short and it was fun and it was goofy and silly. And we both just had a lot of fun like working on it, and we trusted each other's abilities to either respectively design or animate. And we came up with the idea together. We just spent like a couple days on it, and it was so fun and easy. So
that's awesome.
It just depends on the project, for sure.
Yeah.
Like, I think personally, like, even if I'm working by myself, a project outside of my day job that's like a long-term project is going to stress me out no matter what. So
Right. Yeah. My wife and I, when we had our first child, we did an animated birth announcement. And so recently my wife and I we're expecting again, and so we realized we have to make another animation, or else this child's going to feel left out. It's a lot more difficult when you have a toddler running around the house and you want to do a personal project. But it kind of was one of those times where we did have to just be patient, and it took a good month probably to get through a 30-second piece, but
30 seconds is actually pretty impressive. Like 30 seconds can be long.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, we stripped it down, but we were very happy. So
yeah. I want to see it. I didn't
cool.
see it.
So you work with your husband sometimes on passion projects at home, but are you also creating art for yourself in your free time?
Yeah. I do. Okay. Like I definitely do for like my Instagram. I tend to, at least recently, do like much shorter, quicker like doodles for myself. I wish I had more time to invest in long-term passion projects with like really cool concepts. But lately, I mean, we just bought a house, so my current passion project is renovations.
Yes.
But yeah, I think like for my personal work, just to keep me, satisfied creatively, I usually do like really short and simple projects, so that I don't get too stressed about them, because I just definitely I have a lot of anxiety, and so if I take on too much in my free time, it's just not worth it. Like, more than anything, it doesn't inspire me. It just makes me feel like I have to do a chore.
Yeah.
So I usually I'll have like a really simple idea, or like something that's stressing me out, or like a little tribute to someone I want to do, and if that's just kind of stuck in my head, it'll take like a few hours to crank it out, and it's really, I don't know, therapeutic to just create something without having to think about it too much, because at work it's all concept, and there has to be a distinct storyline and a narrative, and 5 people have to approve it. So it's really nice sometimes to just make work for myself that almost doesn't mean anything, but it's just like I get to create and not worry about the parameters, I guess.
Yeah, I 100% relate to that too. I'm curious, have you ever tried doing a kind of dailies on Instagram where you're making something every day, challenging yourself in some sort of way like that?
I haven't intentionally done that for my Instagram. Like, there was a point in the past where I was like, oh, I gotta, put something up every day because it really, like, helps build following or whatever.
Right.
But lately, I've just not really. I mean, I haven't done anything, like, distinct, like 52 day or 52 weeks or, whatever the projects are going around. I think, honestly, like, I just get so stressed with that kind of stuff. It's not worth it. I don't like having to hold myself to those standards.
Yeah.
But I did like a photo project in high school that was 52 weeks, and that was like stressful. So I think from there, I just was like, all right, I'm not going to do that for design.
Yeah. No, I feel exactly the same way. And I think my opinion on it is don't allow yourself to get stressed out. Like, if it is stressing you out, you shouldn't be doing it. Like, I did a stint of about 40 days of an animation a day for Instagram with the explicit purpose of trying to grow my following. And it worked. But the last day I did it was Mother's Day. And I realized on that day that this one thing that I was dedicating time to every single day was not what could be my number one priority. It was causing conflict in my family, and like it's silly that it got to that point. But that's when I realized yes, I'll post consistently as much as I can, but I can't let it take over my life.
Yeah, I totally have experienced that as well. Like when I was posting more often, it was like it was stressing me out more than helping. And then it's just like I had to like rethink my priorities as well, because lately I've just been chilling on it, and it's been like I've felt much less anxiety in my life. So I just don't know how, like, there's a lot of people out there who do like dailies all the time, like people or whatever. Like, how?
People.
I don't. I mean, I guess if you just like have that in your soul and you're just like really good at it, and
right,
it just like comes naturally to you, like that makes sense. You should do it. But I think for most people it's a little stressful.
Yeah, I'm sure. So what we talked about how you work with your husband both at work and at home. But is that different, do you think, working with him than it would be with working with somebody else? Like, does it kind of give you any weird dynamics or cause any tension or any weird side effects that wouldn't maybe happen with just any other person?
Oh, like if I've learned something from working with Tyler and then I go work with someone else? Is that what you're asking?
Right. Yeah, that's a much better way to phrase that. Yes.
Oh, not really. Like, if anything, I've got from Tyler, since we're able to be so honest with each other, I've learned more about like capabilities and like what I should ask of an animator, or like how I should handle certain situations. Like, obviously, like in the heat of the moment, if Tyler and I had an argument about a project, like I'd be like, no, I'm right, and then he'd be like, no, I'm right. But then later, if I'm working with someone else and the same situation happens, I'm like, oh, like I've experienced this before, and I should probably handle it a different way. And like, this is what Tyler was thinking when I came on too strong with my opinion or something. So I think, honestly, it's kind of helped me in my other creative relationships and collaborations. So yeah,
that's a great way to look at it. It's almost like a safety test or something, where you can kind of in a safe space see how you work with somebody else creatively. That's cool.
Yeah, it's get to be really blunt with each other.
Yeah, good. I'm curious about your actual personal style. Do you feel like you've developed a personal style, or is it always changing? I mean, you obviously have a lot of different, a wide range of styles on your portfolio. But do you feel like you're working towards something, or you've landed on something that you're really enjoying at this time?
I mean, I guess you could look at my Instagram and say I have a style, but I don't think it was intentional. I mean, I like what I'm doing, but I think like it wasn't it's not the only thing I enjoy doing. I get to create like lots of different work for work, and then like it's especially funny if you go look at what I did at Gentleman Scholar. I had to like comp a lot of cars into scenes, and like I got to learn. I got to learn like about more than just 2D illustration, and I think I kind of developed a style like naturally along the way without realizing it. But I definitely still love exploring new things, and that's actually something I'm kind of struggling with right now. I feel like I've kind of cornered myself into a style, and I want to be able to try new things, and like post it and not be worried about it.
Right.
So yeah, I don't know if I answered your question properly, but
sure.
But yeah, I love playing with new styles, and I'm like hoping to dive more into like something new soon. Yeah.
That's great. Yeah, I kind of feel like I don't know if I have a specific style. I always like trying new things and getting inspired by other people and then seeing where that takes me. But I feel like I do go through these phases of trying out a new style or a new type of like illustration. I've never been an illustrator, and I'm trying to become a better illustrator and design characters and do things like that I've never done before. So, yeah, it's like the phases.
Your Instagram recently, you had some cool stuff on there with there's like a little smoking guy or what am I thinking of?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, that guy's really cool.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've really started to enjoy character design, and before that, I mean, I was super simple geometric shapes. I just loved making things with patterns, and so yeah, it's just one phase after another.
Yeah, no, I feel like characters are such a hard thing to, learn and get good at. So like once you kind of, I don't know if master is the right word, but once you start feeling comfortable with it, it's like it kind of opens a bunch of doors for what you can do with them. Yeah.
Totally. So we talked a little bit about Instagram, and you have a great Instagram feed. Everybody should go subscribe to you right now, because not only are you posting great stuff on there, but your Instagram stories are hilarious. I love watching them. And your dog is so cute.
Yeah, I love
but do you go to Instagram for inspiration, or where are you finding your own inspiration and following other artists?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, I look at Instagram a lot. I love now that there's that archiving. No, not archiving. Like you can save things, collect things on Instagram. Yeah, so I like follow a bunch of people who do house stuff, but then I also follow, a bunch of artists. So I've got like collections for design inspiration, and sometimes if I'm like, usually I won't go there intentionally looking for something, like it's just like I'm browsing and then I'll be like, oh, that's cool, and I'll favorite it or whatever, and then it's helpful later, like if I'm on a project and I'm like, oh, like where could I look? And I go look at my Instagram collections. So I look there. Pinterest, definitely, like everyone looks at Pinterest, I think. Vimeo, artist websites, Tumblr, like I think especially for work, like these are the platforms I use for inspiration, because a lot of projects are just like they want a specific style, or the client has like a tight timeline. So I'm just like, okay, I need some quick inspiration. Here it is. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, those are all. I mean, the internet has made this entire ability to follow artists and even communicate with them so easy. I love the age that we are in right now.
Yes, so cool.
Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about designing specifically for motion. What is that like? Is it different than when you're just sketching something as a doodle or just a still piece of art? And if it is, how?
Yeah, most definitely different. You have to think about the whole picture in like multiple frames, whereas in still art, you need to tell the story with one frame. So I think it's very different. I mean, it depends on what your role is. So like me as an art director, I'm like thinking about the whole storyboard usually, and like composition and how the colors spread throughout all the frames and everything. But I mean, down to like the nitty gritty of it, you have to think about like, okay, am I setting up my file correctly for the animator? is this going to work in animation, like on the timeline we're on? Does this work with the other designer style that's on the project? Like there's a lot to consider, but I think like the most useful one is just like staying organized in your file structure.
Yeah.
Like I think that's like the worst is if you were, or I've been on projects where we like hired an illustrator who wasn't a motion designer person, like, or who hadn't ever worked in motion design.
Mm-hmm.
And there's just like times where you'll get their file and it'll be like half flattened.
Yep.
And you're like, oh, okay. Like, that's
Yep.
not what I was expecting, but I'll rebuild it.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's super important.
Yeah, and that is something that we're kind of hammering into our students too, is organization is so important. And again, they haven't gone into Photoshop yet, but you guys are going to learn very soon that Photoshop is not nearly as forgiving as Illustrator. So yeah, I think file prep is just so important, especially with characters and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't use Illustrator nearly as much, but like I know from working with animators, it's like more intuitive to use your Illustrator files rather than Photoshop files to import into After Effects. But like even that, like I think I don't really know exactly, you probably know how it works better, but all the layers like split up differently in each of the programs.
Right.
So like keeping an
all
eye
over
on
the
that.
place.
Yeah.
Yeah. So when you are creating art that's going to be animated, then do you have a pretty good idea of how it's going to be moving before you even start making the art?
It depends who's animating it, honestly. Like, I mean, if it was me, I probably would be like, all right, it's just going to move across the frame. No. No, I mean, if I'm, thinking of it big picture, like, okay, I'm going to need a transition here, and I have frame A and frame B, and like I need to get from frame A to frame B with like a really cool transition. A lot of times, like I'll leave that up to the animator. I think for the animator, it's fun. It's like a fun problem solve, at least from Tyler's perspective. Maybe not every animator, but he's told me a lot of times like I would prefer it if like you left that part up to me. So sometimes I don't think about it fully, but I mean, for the most part, like I gotta have a general idea, like, okay, what's this hand gonna be doing in the frame? Or like at least some inkling of idea, like, okay, this phone screen from this shot is gonna morph into a house in the next shot. Like I kind of have to have a general idea of how things are gonna move.
Yeah. And are you planning that kind of thing out on your own, or are you ever sometimes like bringing the animator to your desk and saying, hey, I'm trying to think through this sequence. Can you kind of brainstorm with me how this should play out?
Yeah, actually I do that like all the time. Especially at Oddfellows, like we've been trying to bring animators on from at least the beginning of the project and just be like, all right, here's our timeline, like here's our scope, like we have, 2 weeks. This is what we're thinking for the storyboard. Do you think this is possible? Do you think, like, how much movement do you think there needs to be here? Do you think it's doable to animate this idea we have? And yeah, it's super helpful to have them on from the beginning because a lot of times they'll be like, oh, that's crazy. We can't do that. So yeah, a lot of times I'll have Tyler come over to my desk and brainstorm with me on like transitions and all that. Super helpful.
Awesome. And I'm just curious, have you ever run into any kind of issues where maybe you didn't organize something well enough to be animated, or give something to an animator and they had to send it back to you because something was wrong with it?
I'm sure there's definitely, like time when that happened. I can't think of like a specific example.
Well, that's good.
I think I'm like pretty paranoid and OCD when I lay out my files. I'm like so paranoid. I think actually dating and marrying Tyler has caused me to be super aware of how I'm designing for animation, because like from the very beginning when he was animating in the industry, he'd be like, oh, like someone gave me this file, it's not organized, and I'm like, oh crap, like am I doing that? So I think from the beginning of like my career, I've tried really hard to organize all my files, like name every layer, like separate everything into different folders. And
That's great. That's very, very good of you. Okay, I'm curious if you could give our students some advice. Do you have any kind of workflow tips or tricks in any of the software that you use? Any kind of secret features that you feel like students should know about that are maybe not that commonly used, or any kind of tips with workflow?
yeah, I have a couple. So one thing I really like to do, at least in Photoshop, is setting up actions.
Ooh.
So I don't know if I can think of how exactly I set them up, because either just like built into my workflow at this point, but I might be able to share that with you after. But yeah, there's this really, you guys, I mean, students, you will notice that there's this really annoying thing that happens in Photoshop. If you like try to fill in a shape, there's like this weird 1 pixel line inside of the shape of not filled in.
Yes.
Like, you know what I mean?
Yep.
So that's super annoying. So like set up an action to use one of my function keys. So I select the area I want to fill, and then I have it like expand a pixel so that it fills the part I want to fill like fully, instead of leaving a weird pixel edge. And then I also have an action set up to like change a color of a layer easily. So if I like select a color and I want to, change a bunch of layers, I can just easily do that with a function key. And I also, important to note, I turn the function key feature on in my keyboard so that I don't have to like press FN or whatever that is. I don't know if it's too nitty gritty, but yeah. And then I don't know, like, you guys will probably dive into this a little bit, but like for texturing, I like love using masks in Photoshop.
Yes.
Yeah, masks, clipping masks, like all of that. Like, it's a little confusing at first, but it's in my opinion, the best way to make textured layers. So.
Sure. Yep. And we are going to be diving into masks first thing next week. Awesome. That's great. Do you ever, I'm changing topics a little bit. Thank you for the advice. But do you ever feel like you're not good enough? And how do you stay motivated and persistent when that kind of imposter syndrome creeps up on you?
Yeah, every single day. I'm surrounded by so many talented people at work. It's insane. And then just like all the freelancers we hire, I'm like, who are you? How do you know all this? There's days where I'm like, oh, I'm awesome. And then we'll get like a really cool freelance illustrator in who can create 3 times as much work as me in a day. And then I lose confidence.
Yep.
But I just have to keep telling myself that those people most likely have more history than me in the industry. They probably have more experience, and I also probably have different qualities that they don't have. So I think there's just like a mental push and pull with that. It's definitely a battle, but there's coping strategies.
Yeah, that is a really healthy approach, because there are certain artists out there who are not married, and certain artists who don't have little kids running around the house, and that definitely changes the way that you can operate as an artist. And so coming to terms with what your abilities are, what your strengths are, is a really great piece of advice of accepting that there are going to be people who are better at certain things than you, and that's okay.
Yeah, totally. A lot more people have more time to devote to their work too. So
right.
Yeah.
Cool. What about resources? I know we already talked about where you find inspiration a little bit, but is there anything maybe not online that you've books you've read or films you've watched about being a better artist, or just being a better person in general, time management or anything like that?
I don't have like many specific things, but I do know, like, I think someone suggested to me at one point the book, The Animator's Survival Guide.
Yes.
And I think like a lot of people had that book, but it's really helpful. It's more of like traditional animation, but just kind of helps you get a bigger picture on everything. Like, even as a designer or illustrator learning about motion design, like, you want to have background on animation. Like, I think knowing at least how things should move is helpful. And then I don't know if there's like many other books. But one thing I really like to do is chatting directly with artists that inspire me. Like,
Yeah.
I sometimes it doesn't work. Like, I like reaching out to people and just being like, hey, like, can I pick your brain, or like, want to get coffee if you live in the same city as me? I think it's just really cool to like get people's perspective, because like I said earlier, like, um, you might think the world of someone, and then like you realize, I mean, no, that sounds bad. You might think the world of someone and like be like, oh, they have it all together, but then you like meet up with someone and you're like, oh, they also have their own struggles, and it kind of like puts
Right.
things in perspective. Um, but also like you get to like make that connection and like learn from those people as well. So I don't know. I think like talking to people directly is super helpful and humbling.
Yeah. No, I agree with you 100%. It's almost they're almost like celebrities, your favorite artists. When you're looking up to them, it seems hard to approach. But I don't know about you, but living in LA, there were multiple times where I was just doing my daily, whatever life, shopping at the mall, and I pass a celebrity, and I'm like, wait, what? Like, they shop at a mall too? Like, they're just people. Yeah. So approaching artists, I mean, I love it when students and other people who admire my work come up, whether it's on Instagram or Twitter or whatever, even just sending me an email just to talk to me. Like, I really enjoy having conversations about the thing that I'm passionate about. But it can be intimidating when you're on that end of it, looking up to somebody and you're like, why would they ever want to talk to me? But yeah, I agree. You should definitely reach out to people that inspire you.
It's really cool. And yeah, I personally just like love talking to everyone. You can ask Tyler. I'm just like responding to everyone, but
Yeah.
it's just like, I don't know, it's fun, and like also making connections in the industry. And to that note, I think one of my favorite things to do as a motion designer, like if you can afford it, going to conferences.
Yes.
Because like, I mean, Blend, like,
Right. I have yet to be at a Blend,
oh,
but
you
I
gotta
will.
go.
I will.
I mean, there's only two, so I went to
Right.
both of them, and it's just like such a different story meeting everyone in person and like communicating with people in real life and connecting, and then like, also getting these like cool presentations on workflow and all that. I think it's just like so inspiring and eye-opening to go to something like that, because you kind of immerse yourself for a couple of days. So like if you
Right.
can afford to get out to Vancouver, or like there's other conferences too, like I think Style Frames, and
Hmm.
uh, I don't think F5 is like a big thing anymore, but stuff like that just is awesome for pushing
Yeah.
yourself forward.
Absolutely. And really quickly, you mentioned the Animator Survival Kit, and I would also recommend that. And I'd say you should even look into the iPad version for anyone who's interested, because it's an interactive version of the book where you actually can see animations based on the sketches from the original book. So you can literally see the things moving that are being taught in the book.
Technology.
Yeah. Okay. What about some of your favorite artists? Who are you admiring today?
Oh my gosh, there are so many. I mean, it's crazy now being on social media. It's like it just totally opens your eyes to how many
Hmm.
people are out there. Like, I don't know, I feel like, 10 years ago or something, you just would like go to a museum or
Yeah.
look at, the cast of like who worked on a Pixar movie or something, but now it's like, oh, that person has Twitter.
Right.
So I find a lot of cool artists through Instagram. Like I love, I mean, obviously in our industry, there's like some amazing artists, and I think some of the artists I looked up to most are the ones I understand and ones I've worked with. Like just seeing how their workflow goes. Like we work with Yuki Yamada a lot at
Hmm.
Oddfellows.
Hmm.
And he's just, I don't usually work with him super directly, but like he's just so insanely fast and talented. Like we'll be like, oh, hey, like also he's a lot of times he's in Japan, so like he works overnight, so you like go to bed and you wake up and there's like something from him there, and it's just like, oh, you did all of that overnight.
Right.
He'll just come up with like tons of styles, like, and creative ideas so quickly, and like so much more than I could ever do. It's like insane. So that's inspiring. Um, but I don't know, I also like draw a lot of inspiration from the female talent in the industry, because I can relate to them super well.
Sure.
So I get to like hear their stories on podcasts like this, and also just like speak to them over Twitter, like Joanna Herrera, Audrey Lee. I'm just like, I feel like throwing out names is gonna like bite me in the butt later. B. Grandinetti.
Oh yeah, B. Lynn Fritz. I'm
Yeah.
sure.
Yes. I mean,
Yeah.
there's like a big motion design group for women
Yes.
on Facebook and stuff, and I find a lot of cool artists through there, and like I don't know, there's just so many. I wish I could like give you a list, but it would just be overwhelming, I think.
Yeah, no, I totally understand. I follow all of them myself, so I realize that it's such a huge list. And for students, if you're wondering, the group that you can look up is called Punanimation. And are you part of that, Sarah?
Yeah, I am.
Yeah, it's just an awesome collaboration. Could you give us just a really quick overview of what that is?
Yeah, I mean, really, I'm not like the most involved member. I kind of just like creep, but it was started by B, Hedvig, and Lynn. I think I'm saying their names right. And they wanted to create like a community for women in motion design, because I think before that we were kind of lacking. And so it's really just on Facebook, and I think there's like a Slack for it, but it's just a place for everyone to connect and like, share their experiences. And more than anything, it's like talking about a lot of times, like, not always, but like sexism in the industry, but then sharing work, posting jobs, like it's just a community, really.
Right.
So it's,
yeah.
And then obviously like on their Instagram they have like takeovers, so like a lot
yes.
of they'll have women.
Yeah, that's what I was just gonna say.
Yeah.
Definitely follow them on Instagram.
Yeah, they'll have like takeovers, so like some artists will like show their process in the stories, or they'll like just talk about their daily life, which is really cool to see. So
awesome. That's great. Okay, last question. Is there anything that you wish you had known when you first started learning Adobe software?
Oh my gosh, it was so long ago. I think I remember, just nothing like specific, but I remember getting so frustrated with it, and like I'm sure your students, like it's totally a learning curve. It's hard to learn at first. There's so many buttons.
Right.
There's just so much in it, and I remember feeling super overwhelmed and like, oh my God, I'm never gonna learn this. Like, I don't even know what I can do in this. There's just too many options. But I think learning, I wish I had known how to be more patient with it. Like,
yeah. Because
it really, like, you will learn it. There's no like question that if you're gonna devote time to it, you're gonna learn it. So I think just like staying calm. Don't throw your computer.
Right.
And just like take classes like this, do tutorials, just get in it as much as you can, and you will be comfortable in it eventually.
That's beautiful. I love that. Thank you so much, Sarah Beth, for taking time out of your day to talk to us, and I just wish you the best, and hope everybody after this goes and looks at your work, follows your Instagram. You're just such a fun person to follow. So thank you again so much.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me.
I loved getting to sit down and talk with Sarah Beth and hear her story, because I saw so many similarities between her career path and mine. She really is an amazing artist, and I highly encourage you to go check out her website and follow her on Instagram, because she's posting artwork there constantly, and you can even see behind the scenes of her process. We'll put both of those links in the show notes. She brought up some really great points about reaching out to the people that inspire you, and that's another thing I just want to kind of highlight, because I 100% agree with her. We're living in a time where communication is so accessible, and you're able to communicate with people that you admire so easily. Don't be afraid to reach out to somebody, even if it's just to tell them that you admire their work. The worst that could happen is that you don't hear back. But I can tell you from experience that even if all I can do is read the message and give it a like on Twitter, it means a lot to me anytime somebody reaches out. I also loved the breakdown that she gave of Oddfellow's production process and how she's involved in the whole thing. It gave some really great perspective on how you could be maybe a freelance illustrator brought onto a project versus the actual art director who's managing the entire look of a piece from start to end. I hope that gave you some good insight on where you could potentially take the skills that you're learning in this course in the future. That's all for this episode of the Photoshop and Illustrator Unleashed podcast. Thanks for listening.